I'm Joe Grogan. Welcome to a special edition of DC EKG, where we explore the biggest public health crisis in the United States right now, the addiction and overdose crisis. We have over 100,000 Americans now dying of overdose from opioids. And we are joined by Art Kleinschmidt for a conversation about how to address this. Art has unparalleled experience as a street-level treater. He himself has overcome addiction, and then he got himself a PhD so he could better reach out and save lives. And then he developed policies at the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, at the White House, and at the Office of National Drug Control Policy. This is an important conversation, and many of you may be either struggling with addiction or have loved ones who are struggling with addiction. And we hope you share this episode with those who may need it, and we have contact information for resources that can help the people that need help get it and save more lives. Welcome back to DC EKG. This is Joe Grogan with Eric Euland. We're joined today by Art Kleinschmidt, who is one of the nation's foremost authorities on addiction, overdose, and the opioid crisis that our country is facing. Art, I want to start talking about your expertise, but I know you just got back from the border, so we'll get into that a little bit later. But in my experience in working with you, you had this unique blend of real-world treating experience as well as policymaking experience. You treated people for how many years for addiction?
I started in the treatment industry right after I got sober myself. I got sober January 4, 2002. So after living in a recovery community, I started as a volunteer and then as a tech and then later as a licensed professional therapist, mental health therapist. And
then, so then at the beginning of the Trump administration, you joined the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, is that right?
That is right. I was actually appointed as the senior advisor to substance abuse to the assistant secretary at SAMHSA.
And then I was fortunate. I brought you over on detail to work for the Domestic Policy Council.
Yeah, you also brought me into SAMHSA, but
the backstory revealed. Right. The truth is now out.
And then you went to OND, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, right, where you finished the administration. So that was 4 years.
I served at SAMHSA, and then I was detailed to the White House at ONDCP, and then I served full-time in Domestic Policy Council as the mental health and addiction expert, and then from there I got promoted to the deputy director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy.
Okay, I didn't remember.
4 years, 4 positions.
Pretty much. Well, I stayed to one position, even though I was working in the White House. You maintain. I was a detailee, so I maintained my HHS connection until I actually became the deputy director, which required a presidential appointment.
Okay.
So when he came into the administration, there's a significant challenge, obviously facing the entire country, that the president's incredibly focused on. Challenge of opioids, desperate addiction, death, all sorts of damage throughout a whole bunch of communities. The president campaigned on addressing this directly. He wanted intervention. He wanted a new approach after 8 years of President Obama. Tell us a little bit about how you framed the work when you walked in the first day at SAMHSA and what you were trying to do during your 4 years there.
Well, thank you for the intro. I actually think Trump was one of the best guys on the addiction crisis.
Why so?
Well, he actually took I think the correct two-pronged approach. We had a 4% decrease in overdoses, which was actually one of the largest decreases in overdoses in I think almost 40 years.
And what were the two prongs that helped drive that?
Well, right now you're seeing an emphasis more on demand, but when I looked at what President Trump was doing, we had a dual-pronged approach as far as border security plus working on the demand side of addiction. I also believe that a lot of the messaging that was coming out out of the administration at that time and other professionals actually also helped to the communication to sort of curtail a lot of the use. So jawboning an issue. I don't want to say jawboning, but bringing a light to it actually works to sort of curtail a lot of individual use that people probably don't actually realize that messaging is very important.
So we've had a war on drugs launched in 1970 by President Nixon. You have phases of this war run by Washington, D.C., first Nixon in the 1970s and the 1980s, focus on a lot of interdiction from Central and South America in the 1990s, tightening our drug laws, creating the Office of National Drug Control Policy, focusing a lot on what you can do with criminal law. In the 2000s, we see this infiltration of methamphetamine and dirty methamphetamine into the United States. And then in the teens, we start seeing opioids and all these levels of addiction explode. Talk a little bit about why you wanted the president, support the president's focus on not just talking about the issue, but really addressing the demand side of addiction.
Well, we did a lot to address the demand side. We had state opioid response grants. We actually expanded treatment capacity. We did a lot on the demand side, as far as also a lot of the medication-assisted treatment that we were working on and expanding that as well. But to kind of go back from the drug war days, the 1971 Nixon was quoted as the drug war, was actually a response to a heroin epidemic the nation was facing back then. It started in the late 60s and through the 70s, but coincided with the Vietnam War and a lot of the sort of counterculture. So at that point in time, when they passed that law, we were experiencing about 3 overdoses per 100,000 people. And then that actually did cut the overdose rate quite a bit. And then we saw the expansion where the exponential overdose rate started to incur. The way I pinpointed around 1998. Now, 1998 is actually sort of a significant time period.
Yeah, why is that a hinge year?
Okay, well, it coincides with 2 things. You had the pain, that's when the Society of American Pain decided to make pain as a 5th vital sign. That went along with like respiration, heart rate, those sorts of things, and then it became like pain. You'd measure pain.
So they got together, made this recommendation, and doctors both.
And they pushed it really hard, actually. The VA actually took off with this as well. So when you're measuring pain, it became doctors were going to be graded on how well they anesthetize their patient's pain. Okay. What came of that was the loose prescribing of pharmaceutical medications. So that happened in the mid-'90s, around the late '90s, which coincided with the development of a new drug at the time was called OxyContin. So you had like this very loose permission of pain medicines prescribed throughout the nation, plus you had another chemical added to it, which was OxyContin, which was basically, I could go into the mechanics of that a little bit, but
yeah, because at the time when OxyContin was introduced, everybody thought this was a miracle. This was a great assist to deal with pain therapy, but turns out
well, I would say it was a miracle in theory, right? Right. So like, exactly. Let's say you had let's say you had an 80 milligram of OxyContin, right? And so at the time when they were first coming out, they changed it a number of years later. But all you had to do was have an OxyContin in your hand and a little bit of saliva. And once you took the wax coating off, you were sitting there in your hand basically with pharmaceutical grade heroin. So that's really sort of how it worked. There was no buffer, no cut. It was basically just straight narcotic pharmaceutical grade, basically heroin.
That was the first. Wait, sorry. That was the first formulation of OxyContin.
Correct. Okay. And that lasted for a number of years, by the way.
And so this '98 change in focusing on pain, you have the introduction of OxyContin. How long did it take before the medical profession understood that they'd started down a road that was both very dangerous and ultimately hurting and killing people?
I would say that took a while.
When you were treating people at this time?
No, this is when I was back using.
So you're using, and did you use OxyContin?
I did. Now, I'm pinpointing OxyContin, right, but also other opioids were flying around as well. So this was like one of the more preeminent ones that actually I would say, kind of changed the course of history, but it was like one of the ones that actually sort of altered the landscape with this particular drug. Because usually, a lot of times when you're looking at pharmaceutical medicines, there's a type of a buffer or a cut or aspirin or
something that protects the coats, as you said, so to delay and extend the release and keep the level relatively
well.
low.
Usually, but what I'm saying is this was pure narcotic.
Right, because again, that coating was so thin and the intensity of the dosage was so high.
Yeah, and it also, when you look at it, like a lot of the drugs are hydro, and this was packaged, I'm not a chemist, but this was packaged with oxygen, which actually produces a more cleaner sort of euphoria to the brain.
So just pause a second on that. When you say hydro, are you
hydrogen?
Saying, right, yeah. So you're running it through the production lane, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's
so like hydrocodone compared to like oxy, which is like an oxygen base. I don't, like I said, I'm not a chemist, but I know one of them, the oxy produces a more cleaner euphoric type of high than the other one.
So I'm sorry because I interrupted you because I was interested in your personal experience here, but you mentioned it took a while for doctors to figure out that they had a major problem on their hand population wide. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, about when did people start to talk about oxycodone and doctors start to say, wait a second, we're starting to have an addiction and overdose?
I'm going to say you're going to have to push the needle. Like when I said I got sober at the very beginning of 2002, you're almost going to have to go a decade out. To when doctors
after that,
you almost I don't have the time period.
No, but just roughly the early 2010s.
I do want to paint a picture to you. This was a very lucrative sort of business to open up a pain management clinic. Now I could tell you what that looked like, sort of on the street level. I could paint a picture if you want to hear that. But
absolutely.
So in New Orleans, basically, that's where I'm from. My hometown is New Orleans. During this time period in the late 90s, early 2000s, pain management clinics proliferated throughout all over the city. Doctors and nurses, like the ones that I were using, there was like a nurse that opened up several pain management clinics, and then you get a doctor under contract. So they were like franchising themselves. They weren't just one. And then so people could hire somebody to go to each one of those clinics, and they wouldn't pass along the information that, hey, this guy was just at the other clinic. So you could technically get people to go hit every sort of clinic you wanted.
Stack up.
And then for the longest time, you wouldn't even need records. And they didn't take credit card. They didn't take insurance. It was just cash. And it just flooded the neighborhood. And when I'm saying they had franchisers, they also had competitors competing against alternate franchises. So it became seriously like the wild, wild west with these pills. And it just happened really in my neighborhood like overnight. It just sort of flooded.
So the medical community takes a long time to catch up to this, as well as the public policy community, I think. Because again, to your point, these are unregulated, unsupervised, and this is going on throughout the country. It takes a long time for state and local authorities to realize you've got difficulties here. People are presenting with addiction, serious consequences, side effects of overdose, and then ultimately death. So what drives the change, or people begin to understand, whoops, this has really been a big mistake. We blew it. How are we going to handle making fixes here?
To be honest with you, I don't know. I haven't seen anybody actually say, "Hey, we made a great big mistake there."
Granted,
I mean, I think we understand.
Regulations,
we
laws,
understand. We understand that it was
changes
a big mistake.
in the formulary.
Well, they changed the formulary, right, on Oxy, but by that time, I don't think that had a whole lot of an effect.
Because the penetration of this is so.
Yeah, once people start getting addicted to something, that doesn't stop because a particular drug or formulation actually stopped existing, right? So basically what you did is you already kicked the addiction into motion. So reformulating Oxy, by that time, so as the nation got more and more addicted to these pharmaceutical pills, the Mexican cartels actually backfilled with cheaper heroin coming right across the border. So they were able to kind of capitalize on what we were doing.
This time frame is, when OxyContin is taking off, or you said 2012 or so, you think the medical community?
Well, I don't know exactly. I would say when the medical community sort of got hip to it, but I'm going to kind of point to, like, since everything they were doing technically was legal, I know people don't try to understand that, but if you went to the doctor and whether you were supposed to or not, you end up with a bunch of pill bottles of OxyContin or whatnot, Vicodin or whatever, basically those were all legal transactions. So the reason they were hard to stop, and the reason a lot of these pill mills took a lot of time to actually cease, was because they were basically following the law. I kept waiting, like for instance, I kept waiting in my hometown for the NOPD to raid one of these things. And it wasn't until I actually got into or close to getting into the government, even though I had worked with a lot of people treating them, that I realized, wait, the backbone of all this was federal policy. That was actually pretty startling to me.
And how was that the backbone of federal policy contribute to
Because
these problems?
the pain management clinics, the way they sort of operated, you would walk in there, and what was your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? And I went with my buddy at the time, and he gave him an 8. Okay, so when he said 8, the guy sat down and wrote out 3 prescriptions for him. Okay. And then at this point in time, a lot of the local pharmacists were getting hip to it, and it was getting harder and harder to sort of fill, and people were sort of getting knowledge. So all they did was they faxed it to a warehouse across town in another part of the city, and you would just go to that warehouse, and they would just hand you a great big pad of pills. Okay. So you'd bypass the pharmacist altogether.
I see. And there's just, at that point, no federal, no state, no local touching, regulating
no,
any
not
of
at
that.
all.
Okay, so right now, snapshot, how many overdoses a year are occurring in the United States?
Well, right now, latest CDC data is 108,000. Now, I've been talking to people, and that I've been communicating, which is staggering, by the way. That's
right.
A terrible number, but some people are, talking it's going to even sort of go up from there. What we're seeing out there, so. That's an awful, terrible number. Now, a lot of that is being driven by the synthetic opioids that we're seeing.
So let's get to synthetic opioids after the break, and we'll talk about your recent trip to the border.
Okay.
Great.
Great.